웨비나가 곧 시작됩니다. 전화를 끊지 마십시오. 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 이제 브로드캐스트가 시작됩니다. 모든 참석자가 듣기 전용 모드였습니다.
Workshop with Chonam National University. My name is Lucy and I'm going to be facilitating the webinar this afternoon about logical manuscript structure. I'll be helping Jeff, the trainer, to run polls and exercises, and I'll be chairing the Q&A session. And I'll also be helping anyone who is having any technical difficulties. So before I hand over to Jeff to get started, we're quickly going to cover some administration points. Check that everyone can hear me. Please can you type a yes in the questions box. Brilliant. So we're getting a few yeses come through, which is great. If you're experiencing any problems with audio for this webinar, please type a message into the questions box and I'll be able to help you out. Now I'm going to explain to you how to navigate the GoToWebinar dashboard and how you guys can interact with us during the webinar. So first, you will see a hands raised button. you can raise your hand by clicking on this button throughout the webinar. The questions box is where you will enter any questions that you have for the Q&A sessions today, and you can also communicate to us through it just like you have done so now. In the webinar, there will also be some poll exercises. During these polls, we will ask you to vote what you think the answer is. These answers will appear on your screen, and you'll be able to vote by selecting the answer. Now, there'll also be a Q&A session in the middle of the webinar and one at the end. So as we go through, please type any questions you have in the questions box, and we'll try to get to them in one of the sessions. Great. So that covers everything from my side, and so I'm now going to hand over to Jeff Robens for the webinar.
Thank you very much, Lucy. And I would like to say good afternoon to everyone, and thank you very much for joining us in our Nature Research Academy's webinar in Logical Manuscript Structure. Now, before we begin, let me take a moment to first introduce myself. So I received my PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in the United States. After that, I decided to leave the US and move to Asia. So I've lived both in Singapore and in Japan for the last about 19 years. I'm currently coming to you live from Tokyo as I'm based in our Nature Japan office. Now, before I joined Nature, I did work at a variety of different research institutes, both in Singapore and in Japan. In this time, I have published a number of international peer-reviewed articles. I was also a peer reviewer for a number of international journals as well. Then, about 9 years ago, I decided to leave research and I became an academic editor, where I edited the manuscripts of over 1,000 authors worldwide to help them improve the quality of their papers and the impact of their scientific message. Then about 6 years ago, I joined Nature as editorial development manager, where one of my key responsibilities is developing and conducting training workshops like what we're doing here today to help researchers improve their publication success and impact after publication. Now, although I work for Nature, we are part of a larger company called Springer Nature. So we publish journals under our Springer brand, as well as our Palgrave Macmillan, BMC, etc. Altogether, we publish over 3,000 journals across a range of different disciplines. And both the Nature side and the Springer side have been in business for over 150 years each. So we have a lot of experience when it comes to academic publishing. And what we're hoping to do here today is to share some of this expertise with all of you to give you greater insights into what you need to do to improve your chances of publication success. Now, there are some important points I would like to highlight before we begin. Firstly, the slides. If you go to the handout window section of your GoToWebinar dashboard, you will see the PDF of all of these slides available. Please download them before you leave today. Also, I hope everyone has had an opportunity to download the participant guide. In the participant guide, you will see my email address, the agenda for today, some key points which hopefully be useful as a quick reference later on, and also 2 activities found on page 7. This is an interactive workshop, so we want you to interact with us through these activities. And we do have additional resources found online on page 8. Lastly, we will be having a very short online survey because your feedback is really important to help us improve the quality of these workshops and to ensure we're providing a good standard to everyone. So I'd like to thank you in advance for your participation. Now, as Lucy mentioned, these are interactive workshops. So we're going to launch polls, allowing you to vote for a certain answer. Whenever you see this red checkbox, you know we're going to launch a poll. Sometimes I'll be showing you this blue hand, in which case I'll be asking you to raise your hand in response to a question or a comment that I've made. And sometimes you'll see this purple question mark. When you see this, that means I'm asking you to type your answer into the questions box so Lucy can read your answers out anonymously to the group. Now, upon registration, we did ask you what field of research that you're working in. Not surprisingly, close to 2/3 of you are from social sciences. This is meant to be a social science workshop, but we do have some other participants from other fields as well. Now, because this is really directed towards social sciences, all of the examples we're going to be showing will be coming from those disciplines. However, just because you're not a social scientist does not mean that the strategies that we're going to be discussing are not useful. They are. The important thing about strategies is they are adaptable. So when I discuss the strategies throughout the webinar, what you should do is to try to figure out how to adapt that strategy for your own research. And by doing so, you will make it practical. So although about 1/3 of you are coming from a field outside of social sciences, I would like to emphasize that the content and the strategies are still useful. So what we'll be discussing in today's webinar, it's all about value. That's what editors and reviewers care about. They want to know the value of your research. Why is it going to be something important or relevant for the field? And so you need to use your manuscript to emphasize your study's value. By doing so, you will not only increase your chance of publication success, but even after publication, you will maximize your impact and influence in the field. So to help you to achieve these goals, we're going to be covering 5 key sections in today's webinar. Firstly, we'll have a short section on the planning stages, helping you to set the stage of what you need to communicate in your story. Then we're going to go through the 4 key sections of a manuscript: the introduction, methods, results, and discussion. So hopefully by the time we get to the end of this webinar, you'll have a much better understanding of what editors and reviewers are expecting of you when they receive your paper. So let's begin then with the first section, preparing your paper for the writing. Writing a paper, especially in a language that's not your native language, is a challenge. It is a lot of work. But what can make it much easier is using planning to ensure you know exactly what you want to communicate. And one important aspect of the planning stage is your scientific message. This is the overall message in your paper about what is valuable about your study. Now, related to your scientific message, what do you think would be the most important question to ask yourself before begin? So Lucy, let's go ahead and launch poll number 1 for everyone.
Everyone should be seeing the poll on their screen now.
What is my most important finding? Is it why does my study matter and to whom? Is it can my study be replicated? Or is it which journal should I publish in? For these polls, we generally will give you about 1 minute or so do not feel rushed to choose your answer.
I'll give everyone a few more seconds to get their votes in. And I'm going to be closing the poll now. So Jeff, the most popular answer that we had was at 50% was, why does my study matter and to whom? Followed by what is my most important finding at 37%, and then 13% with which journal should I publish in?
So firstly, I do understand sometimes, yes, we are concerned about the journal we want to publish in, but I am happy to see that the vast majority of you chose the first two options. Thank you very much, Lucy. Now, although the most important finding is clear to you, remember for your reader, this is the first time they're reading about your study, the first time they're understanding why the study needs to be done. And so although the most important finding is clear to you, it will not be clear to your reader unless they have the appropriate context. And that context is related to the second option in that poll. Why does my study matter and for whom? So I do encourage you to have a better understanding of your context, is to be sure you take a step back, see the bigger picture, understand what is that valuable contribution your one study is having to the field, because this is what you have to convince editors and reviewers if you want to get published, especially in an impactful journal. Now, once you have the big picture perspective, that's great, but you do need to have focus as well. If you don't have a very focused manuscript, your readers will feel confused and lost. And when that happens, they'll stop reading. So to help you to focus your paper, I encourage you to first identify the three important factors that your study is about. That first factor is, what is it that you are investigating? Variable, a condition, a strategy, a model. What is it that you're investigating in your paper? Second is, what are you measuring? What is the effect of this variable? What's the outcome you're hoping to measure in your study? And third, the sample. From where are these measurements taking place? It could be a sample population, a device, a site, a database. These are the three key factors you need to define to really ensure you have the proper focus for your paper. The benefit is, once you've identified these three factors, you'll use them to build your central theme. So before you begin writing, identify these three factors, and then you need to write three important statements that helps to establish the theme of your paper. The first of those statements is the research question. This is going to be the motivation behind your study. For an editor, this is essential. Editors are always trying to evaluate studies based on originality and novelty. How do they do that? By looking at your motivation. If you establish there's a very important research question that needs to be addressed, then the originality and the novelty of your study is a lot more clear. Now, in addition to the research question, also try to frame the type of question that it is. Most research questions fall into one of three categories. Either something that's unknown, so no one has explored this yet, you're the first one to do so. Second category is a limitation. People have explored this, however, what's currently available is limited in some way. So your study is trying to overcome that limitation. Or it's a controversy. This group said this, that group said that, but they contradict one another. So your study is trying to resolve that controversy. So make sure when you write your research question that it's not only identifying the gap, but also the type of question your study is trying to address. Now, that's probably the most important statement to write in your central theme, because the other two statements are simply adaptations. First is the aims. The aims is basically directly related to that problem. So once you've written the research problem, then the aims become much clearer for you to write. And the last statement is your conclusion, again, directly related to the problem. So remember, if you tell your readers at the beginning of your story, here's an important problem in the field, well, they expect by the time they get to the end of your story, you have solved that problem. You have come up with a solution. So your conclusion should be written as an answer to the problem you identified. And if you write your conclusion in that way, you're really emphasizing the value your study is bringing to the field. Now, this is also very important for planning your manuscript. So scientific message, 3 key factors, and then building your central theme. But you also need to remember your readers. Remember, you're not writing the paper for you. You know what you've done. You're writing them for others. These readers can include journal editors, peer reviewers, as well as readers in the field after publication. So you need to keep your readers in mind. Give them the information they expect. Part of that is related to the credibility and the trust of your story. Readers want to make sure that they can feel confident in the study, how it was conducted, the analyses, interpretations. So you really need to use a manuscript then as a platform to showcase your credibility. That credibility is related to your subject expertise, how much you actually understand this topic, but also your technical expertise. So they know that the study was done properly and the analyses are accurate, reliable, and reproducible. And that's why these are critical in peer review. Peer reviewers are doing just this. They are evaluating your technical expertise and your subject expertise. Now, luckily, throughout your paper, you have chances to show both. In your introduction, you're really showing your subject expertise, your knowledge in the field. Your methods and results are really focused on your technical expertise of how well you conducted the study, designed the study, and analyzed the results. And then in the discussion, you're coming back to subject expertise, your ability to interpret and to put those results into context. So make sure you use your manuscript to really show your credibility to your readers. Lastly, especially as we have people coming from different fields joining today's webinar, different journals use different manuscript structures. Yes, very commonly we use the one called IMRAD, Introduction, Methods, Results, Discussion. And that's how I'll be discussing it today. But some fields have a variety of different structures that you may be using. And therefore, I think it's important to also keep in mind your reader's expectations in terms of logical flow. Now, the beginning of every paper, regardless of its structure, is to present the reader existing information on that topic. It is helping to set the stage, to give context. Now, once you have provided that context, the middle part of your manuscript is always about presenting new ideas, new results, the new information. And then at the end of your paper, your goal is to take this new information and put it into context of what is already known about the topic. So you're providing a synthesis and then interpreting that synthesis to emphasize the value your new ideas have. So the general logical flow of a paper will always follow what's shown on the screen. So don't worry about the sections that you need to write for your journal. As long as your paper follows this nice logical progression, you know you're guiding your readers effectively. So now that we've talked about the planning stages, let's now move on to the first section of the manuscript, which is the introduction. Now, the introduction is meant to really set the stage, provide context. And therefore, the best way to do so is you start off broad and then you logically guide your readers down to your specific aims. Now, in the introduction, journal editors are hoping that they can show that your paper is relevant for their journal. That's one of the key questions that, of course, editors ask. So how can you really ensure the editor understands that your paper deserves to be published in their journal? Well, it's about how you introduce your topic, because editors have a responsibility not only to their journal, but to their readers. They want to make sure that the way you introduce the topic is appropriate for their readership. So always keep in mind the readers. If you're going to be submitting to an international journal, editors will expect you to introduce your topic from a global perspective. If you're submitting to a regional journal, then having a regional introduction would make sense. But that also means if you're going to submit to a broad focus journal, that suggests to the editor that your ideas have broad applications or broad interest. But it also means people that don't have expertise in your topic is going to read your paper. So you have to more broadly introduce your topic so they can understand it. And then for a specialized journal, if you think your findings are really only useful for people in your research area, you submit to a specialized journal. Well, you know those readers already have subject expertise. You don't have to go into a lot of broad background. They understand it already. So being able to identify the right readers helps to ensure you provide the right context. Let's look at an example. So let's say you're all editors of an international journal. You then receive this paper where it starts off in the introduction by saying, in the United States, there has been a substantial increase in public awareness of climate change over the past decade. Now, if you read this first sentence, raise your hand if you think that this looks like it is appropriate for an international audience. Raise your hand if you think people worldwide would be interested to hear what's happening in the United States. Very few people raising your hands, and I agree. If I was the editor of this journal, received this paper, I probably would reject it. I would say, interesting study. It's too regional for our international readership, and therefore we recommend you submit to a regional journal instead. But luckily, that's not actually how this paper actually started out. Now, this paper was published in an international journal, so Nature Climate Change, looking at shifting Republican views on climate change through targeted advertising. Now, they knew when they were going to report this, provide the context for the study, that they had to do so not from a US perspective, but a global perspective. And these authors did a very nice job in doing so. They started off by saying, climate change threatens people and ecosystems around the world, making it very clear this is a global problem. And given current levels of carbon pollution, its impacts are projected to get much worse. So nice broad international introduction. Then they go on to say, large-scale action is needed to address climate change, not from a regional perspective, global perspective. That's why this is currently important for the field now. However, they now introduce the important challenges. Therefore, it is critical to build public understanding of the problem and demand for solutions. So this is the global challenges that we're facing. So the first part of this paragraph is introducing these issues from an international perspective. Then they go on to emphasize in the United States. So in this case now, they're using the United States as a representative example that they can hopefully then generalize more globally. And to really ensure that the readers understand that this information can be generalized, at the very end they said, understanding what has been driving these changes will be important in influencing future policy development and educational campaigns globally. So you can see this paragraph, they start off very international, then they have the regional introduction, but then they bring it back out to a global perspective, really trying to emphasize to the readers, especially the editor, this study is appropriate for an international readership. So as you're writing your introduction, always keep your readers in mind. Now that's the first paragraph, really to emphasize or introduce the topic and why it's important for the field now. The majority of your introduction is now to introduce these existing ideas. What is the knowledge we already have about this topic that we've introduced? Now, as you're introducing these studies, it's going to be important that you also always be sure to highlight the most recent or up-to-date studies as well. For an editor, they will look at your reference list. And if it looks like that your references are really out of date, that could lead to potential rejection. Now the question is, why? Why would the dates of your references influence the editor's opinion of your paper? So let's go ahead, Lucy, and launch poll number 2 for everyone.
Everyone should be seeing the poll on their screen now.
Select one or more of these options. Does it show your familiarity with what is being done now? Does it show that your institution has up-to-date journal subscriptions? Does it show that your topic is currently relevant for the field? Or does it show that you are using standardized techniques? Which of these do you think would be important for an editor?
I'll give everyone a few more seconds to get their votes in. And I'm going to be closing the poll now. So Jeff, our most popular answer at 82% was shows your topic is currently relevant to the field, followed by shows your familiarity with what is being done right now at 25%. And then finally we had shows your institution has up-to-date journal subscriptions and shows you are using standardized techniques in the field at 11%.
Fantastic. I'm happy to see that most people chose either option 1 or 3, and less people chose 2 and 4. 2 and 4 from an editor's perspective is not going to be that relevant. Regardless if you have up-to-date journal subscriptions, you can always get access to those papers by simply asking the author to send it to you. And in terms of standardized techniques, that's going to be identified in the methods section. But it's the first and third option, as many of you have selected, that is going to be important. Thank you so much, Lucy. So let's say I'm an editor and I look at a recently submitted paper, and almost all the references are from 8, 10, or 15 years ago. Almost nothing was cited in the last few years. Well, I'm going to worry about one of two things. Firstly, maybe this author is not well read. They don't know what's currently being published on this topic. Now, if that happens, I'm starting to question the originality and the novelty of this work, and that can lead to rejection. Or maybe you are well read, However, simply nobody has published on this topic in the last 10 years. Well, that can be a problem as well. So journal editors have a responsibility to their readers. They know people want to read papers that are relevant to their own research. And if there's no papers published in the last 10 years, that means no one is really doing research on this topic right now, which means very few people would find this paper interesting or relevant. And again, that could lead to rejection. So as long as you are citing studies that are up to date in your field, that's going to demonstrate to the editor you are well read, so the novelty and the originality is still there, and it is still currently relevant. Now, for those of you in social sciences, in the introduction, you're often going to be having an extended literature review, which is often going to be called the literature review section. For those of you in natural sciences, you won't have this extra section. You're simply just going to summarize what's being done on the field right now. But for in social sciences, what's more common is to have an extended review of how this topic has developed over time. So you'll start maybe many years ago and then discuss how this topic has progressed. Now, for a good literature review, you need to first start off with the earlier studies and then demonstrate how those earlier studies led to more recent studies. And then after your analysis of the recent studies, emphasizing what still needs to be done now, which leads the reader to your aims or your hypotheses of the current paper. Now, what I want to emphasize, if you want to write a good literature review, it's not meant to be a bibliography of who did what. That doesn't demonstrate expertise. Remember, your introduction is your opportunity to show subject expertise. So to demonstrate that, you need to write this review as a development of the topic, of the ideas, and by whom. Let me show you a bad and then contrast that with a good example. But both of these samples come from the same same journal, the Journal of Asset Management. So same field, same journal, but in one case, the author wrote the literature review in a way I would recommend to avoid. But the other ones did it in a much improved way. Let's look at the bad example first. So you can see I've just taken out 2 paragraphs from the literature review. They go on to say Macintosh reports, and then they talk about their study. Hoogan examines, and they talk about their study. So it's simply one paragraph dedicated to a study. This is a bibliography of who did what. This is not what you're aiming to do. You need to demonstrate why these studies are being done, what are their strengths, but also what are their limitations, and how did one study naturally lead into other studies that had to be done as well. Nice logical progression. Remember, use this section to emphasize your subject expertise. Now let me show you the better example, again from the same journal. Now if you look at 2 paragraphs from this one, you'll see a much more logical progression. They first start off not by saying who did what, but by making a claim. They introduce the topic. Remember, literature review is the development of a topic, and by whom. So they first introduce the topic based on their own expertise and knowledge. So very little consideration is given to fat-related issues and performance attribution when factor risk models are employed to explain the portfolio performance. Of course, this is a business-based paper. So they introduce the topic. Now, anytime in your papers you are making a claim, you have to support that claim with evidence. And that's exactly what they've gone on to do now. They now introduce these papers, which is going to really show how this topic has been developed, first in 2008, and then later on in 2013. But then they go on to not only showcase the merits or the strengths, but they highlight the limitations of those studies as well. They said either of these methods address only the impact of missing factors in attribution, They do not address the impact of constraints on attribution. And by giving these limitations is demonstrating, again, subject expertise. They could understand what was good about those studies, but what would needed to be improved. Now, once you identify limitations, well, that's a nice logical progression to why the subsequent studies needed to be done. So you can see you're now guiding your readers as how this topic developed over time. So as you're writing your literature review, this is how you want to present it to your readers. Start off with your claim, support that claim with evidence, and then emphasize what is important about that topic. For example, limitations that still need to be addressed for the reader. Now, once you've gone through and you've really introduced all the information, the knowledge that those readers need to truly understand the context of your research, now you need to emphasize your research problem. Now, hopefully, you've already written it down. Remember, I recommended to write your research problem, aims, and conclusion before you start writing. So if you've done that, you now just copy and paste this across. Now, in terms of a writing strategy, I encourage you to use what's called signposting to help direct the reader's attention. Most people, introductions have a tendency to be quite long, and so people read through them quickly. You don't want them to miss your research problem. And so a great way to really ensure that readers find that research problem is to use a keyword like however. Whenever people are reading and then they come to a word however, people slow down and they read that next sentence more carefully. Use that to your advantage. And then once you've identified the problem, now you can introduce the aims. Now, I mentioned it is so important that these aims and these problems are strongly linked together. Let me show you an example now of what I mean. So here's a paper published in Nature Human Behavior that children punish third parties to satisfy both consequentialist and retributive motives. Now, here's the research question, the motivation behind the study. They say, but it remains unclear why young children are willing to punish at all in the first place. Do children, like adults, punish for both consequentialist and retributive reasons? Now, in this research question, we should be able to identify those three key factors that I said are always used to build the question: the variables, outcome, and the sample. So the variables, in this case, there's two of them. What are they investigating? Well, they're trying to investigate the reasons as to why children punish. So there's two different possibilities they want to explore. The outcome, what is the effect of what is it they're trying to measure? Well, it's punishment. That's clearly defined. And in what sample are they taking these measurements from? Well, children. So we can see all three key factors are clearly defined. And do we know what type of research question is it? It's unclear. Again, they make it very clear. It's unclear issue. It's not a limitation. It's not a controversy. Again, guiding you with these key words. Now, once we have that, the aims should be directly related, and they are. Here's the aims of this paper. The present work directly addresses this question by testing young children's propensities, so again, related to the same sample, for both communicative and non-communicative, which is related to the two different types of reasons, variables they want to explore for punishment. So again, all three key factors are still clearly defined, helping to ensure we have a strong link. So now let's put it over to all of you, and we're going to go through our first activity before our break. Now, activity 1, found on page 7 of your participant guide. We're going to go through a research problem to identify those three factors. And then based on that information, identify the best aims for that problem. So this paper, as I mentioned in your participant guide, comes from Nature Human Behavior. It says learning is inhibited by heat exposure, both internationally and within the United States. So here's the research problem in that paper. While elevated temperatures have been shown to impair short-run cognitive performance, much less is known about whether heat exposure affects the rate of skill formation in elementary school students. So now within this research problem, we should be able to identify the three key factors: the condition, which is the variable, the outcome, and the sample. So can someone please write into the questions box, what condition are they investigating? A hint is it's a weather condition, if it helps it to make it easy. Please write into the questions box. Any ideas? What type of weather condition are they exploring? Heat exposure. Thank you very much. Exactly. So someone wrote that they're exploring heat exposure. We can see that's clearly defined. This is the variable of interest. Now let's look at the outcome. What are they measuring in this study? Hint is it comes out after heat exposure. What type of effects are they trying to measure? Please write your answer into the questions box. Someone said skill formation. Exactly. They're looking at the rate of skill formation. And now that's clearly defined. And what about the sample? From what sample are they taking these measurements from? Someone said elementary school students. Exactly. So as we can see, we have all three key factors clearly defined. They want to look at the effect of heat exposure on the rate of skill formation in elementary school students. And is this unknown, a limitation, or controversy? Unknown. They said much less is known about this, so we don't know much about it. So again, they tell us exactly the type of question that it is. Now, based on this information, it should be quite easy then to identify the aim. Is the aim, in this study, we combined standardized achievement data for 12,000 US school districts, along with different pedagogical techniques to evaluate the rate of learning among 3rd to 8th graders? Or is it B, in this study, we combined standardized achievement data of 12,000 US school districts, along with detailed weather and academic calendar information to evaluate the rate of learning among 3rd to 8th graders? Or is it option C? In this study, we compared the effects of heat exposure on the rate of learning among all elementary school students across 12,000 US school districts with adult students in professional trade schools throughout the United States. So we're now going to launch poll number 3 for everyone. Which of these 3 aims do you think is the published aims of this study?
Everyone should be seeing the poll on their screen now.
I do apologize because of a character limit in these polls. I'm unable to write the entire aim, which is why it just says aim A, B, or C. But I do hope you have access to your participant guide if you haven't read through these aims already. Only one of these aims is directly related to all 3 key factors: evaluating the effects of heat exposure on the rate of skill formation or learning in elementary school students. Remember, it needs to be focused on the research question. Which one does that?
I'll give everyone a few more seconds just to get their votes in. And I'm going to be closing the poll now. So Jeff, the most popular answer at 45% was aim B, followed by aim A at 32% and then aim B at 23%.
So although we do have a bit of a spread, I am happy to see that aim B was the most popular option, as that is the published aims of this study. Thank you so much, Lucy. So yes, for those of you that chose aim B, yes, this is the published aims of this paper. But let's go through each of these aims so we can identify what they did well and what they're missing. So in this first one, in this study, we combined standardized achievement data for 12,000 US school districts, along with differential pedagogical techniques. Why are they looking at these techniques? That's the wrong variable. They should be looking at the effect of heat exposure, not teaching methodologies. So they're looking at the wrong variable, and that's why this would not be the correct aim. Now, they are looking at the right outcome, rate of learning, and they are looking at the right sample, but it is the variable that's not going to be appropriate. You need to have a strong link. That's the benefit for aim B. So we combine standardized achievement data for 12,000 US school districts, along with detailed weather and academic calendar information. So that way they can assess the heat exposure. And they wanted to evaluate the rate of learning, the clear outcome, among 3rd to 8th graders, the right sample. So they have all three key factors identified that are the same as what was identified in the problem, having that nice strong link. What about C? Well, in this case, they are looking at heat exposure, so that's very good. And they are looking at the rate of learning. The problem here is, why are they comparing elementary school students to adult students? This is not a comparative study. It's not a controversy. If it was a controversy, the heat exposure has been found to have this effect in elementary school students, it's had this effect in adult students, but no study has actually compared them, side by side in the same study. That's trying to resolve the controversy. That's not the problem that was identified. So again, it would be the wrong sample and it would be inappropriate for the study. So to really ensure that your aims is always directly related to your research problem, identify those three factors in the beginning, use them to build those core statements. So with that, that now brings us to our 15-minute break. The way that we organize these breaks is as follows. The first 5 minutes is for you. Please get up, stretch, maybe go have some tea or coffee or water, and think of some questions you'd like to ask. When you come back, please write in your questions in the questions box, and Lucy will read out your questions anonymously, and we'll go through our Q&A session together. So thank you so much for your time so far this morning. Please have a nice break. We'll see you back here shortly. Okay, so welcome back from the break, everyone. So, Lucy, I do think we had a couple of questions that have come in so far. Maybe we can start with those. And if any other questions come in, we can be sure to go to those as well.
Yes, of course. So we had some great questions come in already. So the first one is, how many references should I use and how should I choose which ones to include?
So in terms of number of references, it really depends on the field. So for those of you in social sciences, papers tend to be much longer, and especially with extended literature reviews, it's not uncommon to see 60 to 80 references in a paper. For those of you in natural sciences, so life sciences, chemistry, etc., usually 30 to 50 references is probably more appropriate because the literature review is much more focused. Now, in terms of choosing which ones, yeah, I do understand there's a lot of papers that you're reading. What I would recommend is to really probably balance three important points. First would be the more recent papers should be, of course, prioritized. So, because that's important for editors. Also, those papers published in more reputable journals. So more reputable journals usually have more rigorous peer review, and therefore the evidence you're using to support your claims based on those papers are hopefully those that are more trustworthy and reliable. And third would be those papers that are probably more frequently cited in the field. They're more frequently cited because people in the field think they're important. So if they think they're important, you probably should include them as well. So by balancing those three factors, when they're published, where they're published, and how many citations they have, can help you be more selective of which ones to include in your papers. Good question.
Great. So the next question we've got here is, should I also summarize my key results in the study at the end of my introduction?
Sometimes, yes, that's another good question. Thank you. As I mentioned, different journals do have different manuscript structures. And what you will see for some journals and some fields, after you give your aims at the end of your introduction, you'll also then briefly summarize your key achievements and maybe the implications that they have in the field. For other fields or other disciplines, all of that information would be saved, for example, for the results or discussion section. What I always encourage you to do before you write your paper, always read the author guidelines of your target journal so you know exactly how to structure your paper. But also look at recently published papers in that journal related to your topic. And that way you can get a sense of the editor's preferences in writing style, and therefore you can adapt your own writing style to make it more suitable for publication in that specific journal. Great question.
Thanks, Jeff. That was the we had a couple of questions come through. But if anyone had any other questions, we can get to them in the second half of the webinar.
Sounds great. Well, first, thank you very much, Lucy, for helping to moderate the Q&A session, and to thank you for the attendees for writing in those questions. So let's now move on. We've talked about the introduction. We still have 3 more sections to discuss. So let's move on to discuss the methods. Now, if you ask a journal editor what is important to them about the methodology, they're probably going to tell you 2 things: thorough and transparent. They want to make sure you are clearly describing exactly what was done and how it was being done, because they know this is essential, first, for peer reviewers. That's what one of the first things reviewers look at is your methodology. If they see flaws in your study design or how you conducted certain techniques or analyses, well, that invalidates your results. And if you do not have valid results, your conclusions are not supported, and therefore it leads to rejection of your paper. But if they have all the information they need to properly assess your methodology, they can validate your results are going to be reliable, accurate, and reproducible, and therefore you have the evidence necessary to support those important conclusions. The editors also understand that this is important not just for reviewers, but also for researchers in your field after publication. We all, editors and researchers, want to be sure that the published results are useful. People can build off of them, not just in research, but maybe even practical applications in society or industry. But people can only do that, can only build off your research or apply your research if you give them all the information necessary to be able to do so. And so, from an editor's perspective, because of how important this is, having a thorough and transparent description of your methodology is essential. Now, for a number of journals, including Nature, they're starting to have reporting guidelines, kind of checklists that you have to complete if you want to publish. So, for example, anybody from social sciences or life sciences publishing in a Nature journal has to complete those checklists. And those checklists are all about being transparent related to your study design. So always check the author guidelines. If there's a checklist you need to complete, be sure to do so. Now, generally, of course, the methodology would vary dramatically across different disciplines or even different journals. But briefly, there's three key sections to the methodology. First will be who or what was being used. Then you need to describe your techniques and analyses. And then you'll need to describe any statistical analyses that were being done. Let's first talk about who or what was being used. So it could be participants, materials, instruments, data, etc. Let's look at this nice example that was published in a business journal. So top manager characteristics, agglomeration economies, and firm performance. Now, in this paper, they highlighted a very specific sample that they wanted to investigate in this paper. And so the first thing they did was to describe it. They said, therefore, consistent with existing studies, so they're supporting the rationale with evidence, we consider using the chairman of the firm as the top manager, not the CEO. Now, the question is, why? Why do you think it's important to use the chairman? Remember, your reviewers, researchers, they want to understand what's going on inside your mind. You have to be transparent and describe your rationale. And they exactly go on to do that. They said using the chairman as the top manager of the firm provides a reasonable way to deal with sorting bias. So specifically, high ability CEOs may sort into industries or cities that have strong agglomeration economies because they're looking for more money, biasing the estimated coefficients of the agglomeration economies upwards. That's what they're investigating in the study. So they realized CEO could lead to a sorting bias. And therefore, in this respect, the chairman may be of interest because the chairman is almost always the founder of the firm, and therefore the turnover rate for the chairman is very low. And therefore, having very limited mobility of the chairman reduces the likelihood that the estimates that they measure are biased by sorting effects. So they have a nice, clear description of who. They explain why they thought this is going to be the best option and how it's helping to ensure the validity or the rigorousness of their study design. Always let the people know what your rationale was. So once you go on, of course, however you describe who was being used, highlighting the rationale for transparency, then you need to describe all of the different techniques that were being done. Let me show you another nice example about how to thoroughly and transparently describe your techniques. This one coming from Nature Energy. So the estimation of change in house sales prices in the United States after heat pump adoption. So they wanted to introduce their empirical strategy, and as I summarized in this box, is that they used this DID, this difference in differences model, to measure the effect, the ATT, of heat pumps on housing prices in the United States. Now, so they go on to say they're going to be applying this DID model to be able to evaluate these effects. Now, do you think it's going to be important for them to state why they thought this model was the appropriate one to use? Please write in the questions box, yes or no. Yes, should they describe? Or no, Jeff, I don't think it's necessary. What do you think? Maybe we have one person say yes. Anybody else? Okay, we have a couple more people, one person saying yes. We have another person saying no. No, Jeff, I don't want to share my rationale. That's going to give away all of my tips of how I succeed, in my research. Now, unfortunately, you do need to be transparent. If you do not explain why, if there's a variety of different models available, if you don't explain why you chose model A over models B or C, then that will lead to questions about, were you familiar with those other models, and do you actually understand those models? Remember, this is your time to show technical expertise. And part of the way you show your technical expertise is explaining the rationale as to why you choose one framework or strategy over another. And that's exactly what these authors have done. You always need to explain rationale as to why you chose a specific methodology, and then support that rationale with evidence. Now, if there's only one way to evaluate it, then of course you don't need to explain your rationale. What I mean is, if there's a variety of different ways you could have evaluated this, you chose one, that's when you need to explain why. So these authors did so very nicely. They said, there are three common challenges when estimating this effect in our study, namely selection bias, omitted variable bias, and model dependence. So they emphasize there's three important biases here. They first now go on to describe each of those biases, supporting it with published evidence. So they first talk about selection bias, and then they talk about why they think selection bias is going to be important for their specific study, so the relationship to their work. Then they could talk about the second bias, omitted variable bias, again, supporting that claim with evidence. And then again, emphasizing why this is relevant for their specific study, why this is something they have to be careful about. Then they talk about the third potential issue, which is the model dependence. And then again, explain why this is relevant for their study. So they said there's three common challenges. They talk about each challenge, what it is, and how it's related to what they're trying to evaluate. And then after going through that thorough description, they go on to say, to address these concerns, we use the DID method to estimate the effect of adopting a heat pump on the house sales price. That's why they chose the DID. DID model helps them to overcome the challenges that otherwise the other models would be limited by. And then, of course, once you've established why you chose that methodology, then they have a nice thorough description of that model. They talked about the equations. After they introduced the equation, they talked about the variables, the assumptions, and how this equation was being applied in their analyses. But I think it was also nice, if you look at the end of each of these, they talk in terms of transparency, additional information. For this first transparency, they wrote, we found that the coefficients of the interaction are insignificant, which is consistent with a parallel trend assumption. And that's going to be shown in supplementary note 2. They're transparent. At the end, they said, we also conducted additional robustness checks to really validate this model was appropriate. And they said, we still observed a price premium for the heat pump, supplementary note 8 and supplementary table 16. So again, they use the DID model, but they validated that model with other strategies. And again, transparently share that information. So when a reviewer reads through these methodologies, it is very clear. These authors have a very strong understanding of the field. They understand the different types of analyses they could use, and they're able to choose the right one. establishing confidence and trust in the study. And then after you talk about your different techniques and analyses, then you need to talk about any different types of quantification methods that were being used and statistical tests. Now, statistics is always difficult for many of us, unless, of course, you're a statistician. So I do encourage you, if you're using statistics in your analyses, please do consult with a statistician. There are so many different types of analyses that can be performed. And if a reviewer has any concern that the statistical test you used is not appropriate, they're going to tell the editor. The editor will then send your paper to a statistician. The statistician will validate whether or not it was done properly. And if they find you used the wrong tests or you interpreted those analyses incorrectly, again, that could lead to rejection. Now, there are some really nice online sites to help you to be familiar with the different statistical analyses that are available. We have one at Nature called Statistics for Biologists. It's not just for biologists. People in social sciences or other fields can use it as well, of course. It's simply introducing the range of different tests that are available, when they should be used, categorical variables versus continuous variables, parametric versus non-parametric distributions. They talk about the assumptions of these different tests, the limitations, and how you should properly interpret those analyses. Now, this is not meant to replace a statistician. I encourage you to read through these kind of resources before you talk to a statistician, because by doing so, you'll have a better understanding what it is that they're asking of you. So now that we talked about the importance of being thorough and transparent in your result and your methods, really emphasizing rationale as to why you designed and conducted your study in that way, let's now move on to the results section. Now, one thing I would like to highlight is up until now, nothing that you have written is new. For most of your readers in the introduction, they've probably read those papers already. That's old research. Your methodology is probably describing currently used techniques that, again, many people are familiar with. So it's not really until they get to the results as to when they're going to find that new information. But remember, this is when they can get confused. Because although you are very familiar with your findings, the readers are not. They're reading about your analyses for the very first time. And if you're not guiding them carefully through all of your analyses, all of your results, they will get confused and lost. When that happens, they stop reading your paper and you have lost impact. So you need to guide your readers logically. What I recommend is to just do so one figure at a time. Don't overwhelm your readers with new information. That's a great way to get confused. So first talk about figure one. And after you're done talking about figure one, then you introduce figure two. And if you have a complex figure, just break it up. Maybe if you have 6 panels, you talk about panels A, B, and C in one paragraph, and panels D, E, and F in another paragraph. Keep paragraphs short. The last thing someone wants to see in your results section is a paragraph that takes up the entire page. The first thing people think of is, oh my gosh, that is a lot of information for me to process. Don't do that to your reader. So another important way to guide them is to really structure your paragraphs properly. Now, the nice logical way to structure a paragraph, which you'll see is quite similar to what we described in the introduction. Remember, in the introduction, you introduce a claim, you then support that claim with evidence, and then you state what's important about that topic to the reader, for example, a limitation. That same basic structure is used in the results. You first introduce, not in this case your claim, but you introduce the figure in the first part of the paragraph. Then you want to tell the reader what they're supposed to look at. What are the important trends or patterns they hope to be able to see in that figure or table? And then finally, if they're going to remember one thing about that figure or that table, what is it? Don't expect them to remember all of that data. Why would they? This is not their study. You need to decide what's the most important takeaway message and tell that to the reader. So let's look at a nice example published in Nature Communications, a computational reward learning account of social media engagement. So what this paper was looking at was Instagram. They wanted to look at what influences people posting frequency, how quickly they post their next post on Instagram. And their idea was that reward learning was an important model, was an important way to emphasize. The greater the reward, the more often they post on Instagram. The fewer rewards means the less frequently they post. And rewards was simply evaluated by the number of likes that they received. So they wanted to apply a learning model. So see if they can mathematically simulate of how these rewards influencing the posting activity and replicates what's seen in real life. So that's what the study is about. What I'm showing you here is half of figure 3. So they divided, figure 3 was quite complex. One paragraph covered figure 3, D, E, and F. So what they did here is they're looking at topics. So posts related to men's fashion in D, posts related to women's fashion in E, and posts related to gardening in F. And on the y-axis, we have the post latency. The smaller number means they're posting more frequently. Higher number means they have a higher latency, so they're posting less frequently. And on the x-axis, we have low rewards, so very few likes, or high rewards, so a lot of likes. So now I've explained what we're looking at, and remember, they're going to compare real-world data, which is plotted by these light-colored dots, with what their model can compute, simulate, as shown by the more dark lines, so the circles with the dark lines. So now I've explained this to you. So we're comparing real-world data versus computational data for men's fashion, women's fashion, and gardening to look at the effect of rewards on post latency. Now that I thoroughly explained, you should clearly know what you're looking at. What do you think is the takeaway message of this figure? Is it A, that men are less influenced by rewards than women? So A versus D versus E. Is it that the model does not fit the gardening data? So although we see it fits these two, it doesn't seem to match the real world data for gardening. Is it C, high reward reduces post latency? So when there's a higher reward, that people post more frequently? Or is it D, that gardening posts have the shortest latency? So if we look at the y-axis, the scale, we see gardening has a much smaller scale than men's or women's fashion. So what do you think is the important message here? So Lucy, go ahead and launch poll number 4 for everyone.
Everyone should be seeing the poll on their screen now. I'll give everyone a few more seconds to get their votes in. And I'm going to be closing the poll now. So Jeff, the most popular answer was high reward reduces posting latency at 52%, followed by gardening posts have the shortest latency at 35%.
Okay, and I'm not surprised to see that we do have a spread, and even few of you choose the model doesn't fit gardening, and some people think men are less influenced by rewards than women. But don't assume, of course, that only women are posting about women's fashion. Men could be doing so as well. But I'm not surprised to see a spread that most people like option 3, but also quite a few of you like option 4. Thank you so much, Lucy. The point of this activity was to emphasize that even though you know exactly what you're looking at, what's important about that figure is going to be different for different people. Everyone will have their own interpretation. Now, as an author, that's a problem, because if people have different interpretations of your data, therefore they may not really understand the value of what you're trying to communicate to the field. And that's the importance of the results section. It's to help ensure that the readers all can see that same thing that you see when you prepared your figure. Because for you, the figure is obvious. But when your readers look at your figure, they may have different interpretations than you will. So let's look at how these authors explained or introduced these 3 panels. So they first introduced the figure by saying, we again conducted generative model simulations of this reward learning model based on the median estimated parameters to test whether the model reproduced the effect of average reward rates on posting latencies. They're introducing the figure to you. And then they highlight the 2 key trends. Trend 1, as expected, a higher reward predicted faster responding. So for those of you that chose option 3, yes, that's one of the key things you should have gotten out. And they supported that with the evidence, including the p-values, to show significant effects for all 3 different types of topics. But they also said there's another important trend, and that is that these show that their mathematical model that accurately reproduce the effects of the reward observed on the trend. In other words, it accurately represents the trend, not the actual data itself. They're not trying to say the model recapitulates the data, but it reflects the trend of the actual reward. So now that we know what we're looking for, yes, we can see for each of these, we do see a decrease in post-in latency with higher rewards. And if we compare these lines for the actual observed data from the simulation data, we can see they're always parallel, suggesting that the model is always going to accurately reproduce the trend. But they did note that it was overestimated for the gardening posts. Now, what's important then? What's the takeaway message? Does the author expect you to remember everything? Of course not. They said, together with the first study, so they had 3 different studies in this paper, together with study 1, these results confirm that basic reward learning theory provides a powerful tool for predicting and explaining dynamics of social media independent of the topic. Didn't matter if we're looking at men's fashion, women's fashion, or gardening. Their mathematical model could accurately reflect those important trends that are observed. So they have a nice description. This is how I encourage you to structure your results as well. Introduce the figure to your reader. Tell them what are the important trends and patterns they are expected to see. And then altogether, why is this valuable? Now, people often confuse this with an interpretation. An interpretation is an inference. It's your opinion. This summary that I'm talking about at the end of the paragraph is based on evidence. As long as your evidence supports the claim that you're making, that's not an interpretation. An interpretation would be, this model will be useful for predicting trends in other topics as well. Now, that's an interpretation. Interpretations belong in the discussion. as long as your claim is based factually on the evidence presented. In other words, in this case, that this model accurately predicts trends in different topics. That's true. Everybody can look at this figure and see that that claim that they made is supported by the evidence. Then that's fine. So don't confuse this with me saying make your interpretations. No. Interpretations, your opinions, go in the discussion section. Well, that now leads us into the discussion. So now we've talked about the existing knowledge. We've talked about the new information. That brings us to the end of the paper, typically the discussion, where you need to provide the synthesis. Now, the discussion I like to see as the opposite of the introduction. Remember, the introduction starts off broad and then narrowly guide your readers down to your specific aims. Well, your discussion should start off narrow and then guide your readers back out to the general implications in the field. Now, the beginning of your discussion, you should summarize your key achievements. You always want to start off on a positive note. Now, it could also be useful to also restate what was the important problem that you were trying to uncover in your paper. This is giving the reader context for these key achievements. Just one or two sentences. Currently this is important for these reasons. However, this is still unknown. And then therefore, here's what we've been able to achieve in our study. And by giving that context, makes those achievements look to be a lot more important. It's a useful strategy. Now, the majority of your discussion is your interpretations. So what did you find? What do you think this means? And how is this related to previously published studies? Either how is it similar to or different from what's been published? Now, as we talked about expertise, remember introduction, subject expertise, methodology, results, technical expertise. The discussion, we go back to subject expertise. So let me show you a nice example of how some authors have really used this section to emphasize their subject expertise related to the research. So here's a paper published in Nature Human Behavior. This is the one we talked about in the activity about heat exposure. So first what they do is they summarize their key findings. You don't have to go to a lot of details. You already went through all the details and the results. You just want to summarize here. So we find that heat exposure during the learning period slows the rate of human capital formation, so learning, in part through persistent disruptions in the learning process. So they summarize their key findings, and then they put that into immediate context of what's also known about heat exposure. So they said this matches emerging findings on the effects of temperature on labor capacity, morbidity and mortality, and short-run cognition. And they support all of these claims with evidence, in this case, published evidence from the field. But now it's time to showcase your expertise. Why do you think this is important? Interpret. So they said, however, we note that this analysis does not imply or suggest that heat exposure is the only mechanism at play. Many others are also relevant in explaining the relationship between climate and levels of human capital across countries. So they realize that yes, that heat exposure is important, but other factors are likely important as well, based on their understanding of the field. And therefore, what are their recommendations? A great thing to do in your discussion section is to generate new hypotheses. Editors love that. Why is that? Well, if you are generating new hypotheses in the field, suggesting what else needs to be done, that means those studies may be done. And therefore, they're going to cite your paper. And the more citations your paper has is good for you, but it's also good for the journal. editors love citations. So when they see that these discussion sections are really suggesting new research or that should be explored, it usually has a good positive influence on the editor's opinion. And so that's what these authors have done. They said teasing apart these different potential mechanisms in greater detail. And what do they mean by potential mechanisms? Again, showcase your expertise. They said, for example, determining whether hotter temperatures drive student and teacher absenteeism, or whether poor nutrition and hunger may exacerbate heat-induced cognitive impacts, and the understanding of the extent to which these mechanisms are interacting with one another are the important questions for future work. So they're giving recommendations of, based on what we've shown, what would be the next steps going forward. This is the value this study is bringing to the field. So this is a nice logical flow. Summarize your findings, put it in context of what's already known, based on a synthesis of those findings and your understanding of the field. What do you think this means? What is your interpretation? And then based on that interpretation, what are your recommendations for the field going forward? A great way to guide your readers through the value of your study for them. Now, sometimes, of course, this is, you were talking about positive results, but sometimes you're going to have negative results. Now, if you have negative results, nobody likes them, of course. But do you think it's still useful to share those negative results? Please raise your hands if you agree. Yes, Jeff, I think it's useful to share negative results with the field. Okay, we have quite a few hands. We're going up to about 25% of people are raising their hands. The other people are saying, no, Jeff, I don't want people to know my failures. You know, I understand, of course, negative results are not something that we want to have, but they are there. But sharing them is useful. Negative results have a positive impact for a number of reasons. Firstly, it helps to prevent research waste. If you show what works and what doesn't work, well, people in the field know, don't try to do what doesn't work. It's a waste of their time and resources. Instead, emphasize how these negative results generate new hypotheses. I already emphasized editors like hypotheses in your discussion because that suggests more research will build on what you've been able to publish. More citations for you. And also from a reviewer's perspective, this is useful for robustness. It means you knew exactly what needed to be done. Some of your results were positive, some were negative. But you knew those negative results, that those techniques needed to be done. In other words, your study design is thorough and rigor, and that helps you to go through the peer review process. So it's not about having negative results, it's about how you present negative results that's important. First, you state what the result was, but then based on your familiarity in the field, establishing subject expertise, why do you think it was negative? And then based on that why, that interpretation, what would be your suggestion for the field going forward? What are other ways to approach this important problem to overcome this issue? And then if you're ever worried that these negative results may impact the validity of your study, highlight that. Now, the way you report negative results is actually quite similar to limitations. All studies have limitations. It's your familiarity with those limitations, and by interpreting those limitations, that's important. Let me show you a nice example of how you can present your limitations by highlighting technical and subject expertise. You first do so by stating what was the limitation, what was going to be the generating new hypotheses, and of course, at the end, the impact of the validity of your study. So here's a paper published in the Journal of International Business Studies where they highlighted some key limitations. They did it in a very positive way. So I won't read through the entire section of their discussion section. Rather, let me highlight the key messages. They first start off by saying, our study has a number of limitations. First, our theoretical arguments are only focused on the dependence on a foreign partner, not the local partner, only the foreign partner of these international joint ventures. That's a variable limitation. Well, then now they give, if you knew this was a limitation then why did you only look at the international partner? Again, state rationale. Otherwise, you're going to lose that technical expertise. They say we chose to focus the dependence on the foreign over the local partner based on the premise that foreign partners are comparatively more capable than local partners of selecting alternative mechanisms to absorb these external constraints. So in other words, we felt that the foreign partners were probably more relevant into why a joint venture may dissolve over time. However, again, generate hypotheses. Future studies may wish to complement our theoretical argument and our analyses by examining the dependence of the local partner as well. So we do understand this is something that should be done. It's not in the scope of our study, but additional studies may wish to explore it. Yes, they then go on to say that they have a regional limitation as well. So our study is based on data gathered from one country, China, and that may limit the generalizability of our findings. They knew this was important because they're publishing in the Journal of International Business Studies. So they realized that the editor may worry that this study that's regionally focused wouldn't be useful for an international audience. So again, what's the rationale for only choosing one country then? Well, we chose China as a major emerging economy that show high levels of government involvement in economic activity. And therefore, in this respect, China is comparable to other emerging economies like Russia and India. In other words, it's a representative example that's useful outside of China as well. But again, have to generate hypotheses based on this limitation. They go on and say, therefore, we do think our findings are applicable to other emerging economies. Nonetheless, future research in other research settings would be needed to explore contextual variations. And then finally, based on all of these different limitations, is this going to limit the usefulness of this research? The answer is no. Despite these limitations, we believe our findings are robust and our study provides novel insights into the factors that affect the dissolution of these international joint ventures. They're trying to emphasize their study is still valid. So it's a nice description of how they're able to present the limitations, highlighting technical expertise with rationale, but also subject expertise by giving recommendations for the field going forward. That brings us now to the end of the paper, which is the conclusion. This may be just the last paragraph of the discussion, or it may be an entire section entitled the conclusion. Regardless of the structure, please remember, your conclusion is the last thing people will read, which means it will be what people remember most. So as an author, you need to decide, of everything I've communicated in my paper, what is most important for the reader to remember? And there are three key things to keep in mind. One is your main conclusion, which should be a solution to the problem. Two, what is the one or two key findings? You presented a lot of data. Your readers won't remember all of it. They won't know what they should remember. You do, because it's your study. So tell your readers, of everything I've presented, this is what you need to remember. And then what are the immediate implications for the field? How will this information be useful for the field now? Now, if you want to publish in a high impact journal, you have to go a step further. And that step further is what I like to call a thought leadership statement. Remember, I told you in the beginning to take a step back, see the big picture, understand the valuable contribution your one study is having on the development of the field going forward. This is not just how it can be used right now, but how it's going to shape the field going forward. That's the thought leadership statement. And high impact editors are looking for that important message. Let me show you a nice example in Nature Climate Change. Right-wing ideology reduces the effects of education on climate change beliefs in more developed countries. So here's the main conclusion. They said, in sum, this research extends previous findings by systematically analyzing the interactive effects of education and political ideology across countries from 6 continents, and show that these effects vary as a function of the level of the country's development. Now, this is the conclusion, and what problem is it solving? Well, here's the problem in the beginning of the paper. However, empirical research into the relationship between the degree of a country's development in climate change beliefs has yielded mixed and inconclusive results. Well, they've been able to solve this to say yes, that the level of a country's development does influence this important effect. So they've solved this important issue. They then go on to summarize the 2 key findings, that 1, education had a positive effect, and 2, that overall the community does not deny climate change has human origins. Those are the 2 key findings they summarize. This is what they want you to remember. And then what are the immediate implications? How is this useful to the field now? Now, when you talk about implications, a great strategy is to use hedging terms. This suggests, it seems that, this is likely useful for. These hedging terms mean you don't have evidence to support this. This is your opinion based on your understanding. They said, it seems that enhancing education may be the key, but more research is still needed to understand why education has a negative effect in some countries. This is why this information is useful now. What about that big picture perspective? How is this information going to shape the field going forward? Well, in these contexts, decreasing partisanship around climate change may be necessary to make literacy interventions instrumental in curbing anti-climate change beliefs. So going forward, these are the types of big picture perspectives we need to keep in mind. So you can see in the final paragraph, they highlighted everything that's valuable and important that the reader should remember. So before we have our survey and Q&A section, let's now go to activity 2 found on page 7. Now this was taken from Nature Energy, and this was paper looking at the impact of policies on business models in income equity and rooftop solar adoption. So on the roof, sometimes people put solar panels, and it's already been understood that wealthier communities have more solar panels because they can afford them. And lower income communities, they don't because they're expensive. But even amongst lower or middle income communities, they see differences. And they want to know what are the factors that influence the adoption of these solar panels in those communities. So they said, however, while many studies have explored how income affects adoption of these rooftop solar panels, the literature has yet to explore which factors explain local differences in the adoption of these solar panels among low and moderate income households. So which of these 3 conclusions do you think is answering the problem? Is it A, in summary, we demonstrate that policy interventions increase adoption equity in existing markets and shift deployment into underserved markets with lower income levels? Or is it B, in summary, we demonstrate that LMI incentives, leasing, and property assessed clean energy financing increased solar panel adoption equity? Or is it C? In summary, we demonstrate that policymakers can increase adoption equity through measures that address specific barriers to LMI adoption and shift solar panel deployment patterns into previously underserved areas. So which of these three do you think is the published conclusion that's answering the problem in the field? So Lucy, let's go ahead and launch the last poll for everyone.
Everyone should be seeing the poll on their screen now. I'll give everyone a few more seconds to get their votes in. And I'm going to be closing the poll. So Jeff, the most popular answer we had was conclusion C at 43%, followed by conclusion B at 38%, and then conclusion A at 19%.
Okay, so most people think it's either conclusion B or C, which are both quite equally represented amongst the attendees. Thank you so much, Lucy. So for the 38% of you that chose option B, that's exactly the correct one. So let's go through each of these so you have an understanding. Actually, all three of these statements are at the end of the paper, but they're all presenting a different idea. Let's first look at A. So by understanding which one's going to be the best one, let's also understand what is the problem. The problem here is, well, which factors are influencing the rooftop solar adoption? So that's what they emphasize, which factors? So the answer would be identifying the factors that influence adoption. If we look at A, what they're simply emphasizing are their key findings. What they found was that policy interventions increase adoption, equity in existing markets, and can also shift deployment into those markets with lower incomes. It's not telling you which factors, it's just telling you about how those factors influence the adoption rate. And that's going to be the actual key findings. For B, they tell you the three factors. The problem is we don't know what those factors are. That's the variable of interest. Well, they've identified them. It's LMI incentives, leasing, and property assessed clean energy financing. Those are the three factors that explain the differences that we see in these different households. They're answering the question. And then for C, in summary, we demonstrate policymakers can increase. Well, this is their recommendations. They're recommending that this is a strategy policymakers can use going forward. Now you might say, but Jeff, I thought you said for implications they should use hedging terms. And in this paper they did. In the paper, the way this sentence is actually written is, broadly, our results suggest that policymakers can increase. I changed it for the purpose of the activity because otherwise it would give it away and make it too easy of an answer. But yes, in the actual paper, you would want to use hedging terms as these authors have done. So remember, your conclusion should always directly answer the problem. The problem here is what factors in your conclusion should identify those factors. So with that, that brings us to the end of our webinar today. We we've talked about the strategies you should be using to really emphasize the value your research will bring to the field. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, we do have a short survey. It takes most people just a couple of minutes. So we're going to give you a few minutes to do the survey now. You can either do so by simply scanning the QR code on your screen. It's perfectly compatible with the mobile phones. Or if you prefer, you can type in this URL into your computer if you prefer to do it online. You simply just yes, yes, no, no, yes. Very simple. So we'll give you a few minutes to do this now. When you click on Start Survey, please select Author from the drop-down menu. And then the only module we went through today was manuscript structure. The other modules they ask you about, please ignore because we did not cover them in today's webinar. So we'll give you a few minutes and then we'll come back for a final Q&A session. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone. We sincerely appreciate the time you've taken to answer some of those questions on how we can improve the quality of these workshops. We're now going to move to our final Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please feel free to write them into the questions box so Lucy can go ahead and read them out. I do see we have one question already, maybe two questions, I guess. Lucy, if you can maybe start with those, and if there's any other questions that come in, we can go to them as well.
Yes, of course. So the first question we've got here is, does presenting negative results affect my paper's acceptance?
Great question. And I think that's one of the reasons people are worried about sharing negative results, is they think it will affect their acceptance. Not necessarily. The reason a paper is accepted, well, there's a few reasons. It's in scope for the journal, it's relevant for the field, but also importantly, that the evidence presented in the paper is sufficient to support their conclusion. So the reason it would be rejected is because the conclusion is not supported by the evidence, which means as long as you have enough positive evidence to support your conclusion, if you also have some negative results that doesn't affect that conclusion, then you're fine. So it's not that editors say, well, they have this much positive data, this much negative data, let's reject it. No. They say, is there enough evidence to support their conclusions, yes or no? As long as you have enough, then those negative data should not influence the acceptance of your paper. Great question, though.
Fantastic. So the next question we've got here is, what about journals that have a combined results and discussion section? How should I prepare these sections?
Yeah, that's not, that may be coming from some of the people from physical sciences here. Yeah, in physical sciences, it's quite frequent to have combined results discussion rather than separate results discussion. Or for those of you that are writing a narrative type of paper, like a letter, you're expected to interpret your results immediately after presenting it, similar to results discussions, combined results discussions. My suggestion in terms of a paragraph structure, you still first introduce your figure, you still talk about the trends and patterns. That doesn't change. But then immediately after talking about the patterns or trends in the figure, now you immediately interpret them in the context of what's already known. And then overall, what is the synthesis? What is the value of your findings for the field? So it's a much more abbreviated step-by-step interpretation of your data as you present them. And so as long as you do it in that way, again, you'll logically guide your readers from one figure to the next. Great question.
Fantastic. We haven't had any other questions come through. We've just had a couple of comments from people saying that they really enjoyed the lecture, which is always nice to get. So thank you so much, everyone. Yep, so Jeff, I'll leave you to get you to say thank you and that kind of thing, and then I can end the webinar if we haven't got any more questions.
Wonderful. Well, firstly, I'd like to thank you, Lucy, for taking time today to help to moderate the polls and facilitate the webinar. I would also like to thank Jeonnam National University for the wonderful opportunity to be able to be here today with all of you. But importantly, I would like to thank all the attendees. I understand you have very busy schedules, and I appreciate you taking time out of your Thursday afternoon to spend it with us. And we hope that the information we have gone through will be useful when you're writing your paper to help you to increase your chance of publication success. Please stay safe and stay healthy, everyone. Take care and have a great week ahead.
Thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. I'm now going to close the webinar.